Hey Stan, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Yeah, so Stan, as a CFT therapist, you know, you've done a lot of work in the fields of anxiety and depression, and those are two of the main areas that we're going to be chatting about today. And as a practicing psychologist, as I'm sure you've seen, the rise of anxiety and depression is just so prevalent in our times today, and I think that it's important to be able to help people get some tools and some insight into exactly what's going on, and just look at it from a compassion focused therapy lens. And so I'm really looking forward to our chat today, so thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you're right. It's important stuff. There's so much going on in the world, isn't there, really? And let alone things closer to home. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking through it all with you.
Great. So I think a great place for us to start is really to just lay a bit of a foundation about the theoretical orientation of compassion-focused therapy. So maybe let's walk through the three-circle model of of emotional regulation. So how would you describe that in a really simplistic way?
Well, compassion-focused therapy, I suppose one of the things to start with is just to mention that CFT is really an evolutionary based approach to psychotherapy. It's an integrative approach, but at the heart of it is the evolutionary kind of theory. And I suppose one aspect of that is, as Professor Paul Gilbert, who's the founder and developer of CFT, as Professor Gilbert would say, we have tricky brains. He would say it in more of a Derbyshire accent, so I can't quite do that. Yeah. But this is really, in some ways, at the heart of it. In some ways, this is also where we really would begin with CFT, and that is to think about these evolved brains that we have, these brains that have evolved over millions of years and have kind of adapted and changed really to aid in human survival and reproduction, pretty much. That's sort of what evolution is about, is survival and reproduction. And unfortunately, evolution's not so worried about our happiness, I guess. And so there are aspects of the human brain that are exquisitely designed for aiding in our survival, but come along with trade-offs. A lot of evolved aspects of our brains and bodies and so on really come along with certain trade-offs. And so this is a key place to start with CFT, is just to recognize that we do have these tricky brains. What the first piece of that is what you're alluding to, which is we like to affectionately call it the three circles model, and it really starts to give us a bit of a sense of actually the old brain aspect of our brains. And when I say old brain, I guess I mean evolutionarily speaking, the aspects of the human brain that perhaps we share with other mammals and other animals and so on. And these three circles, they've evolved to help us to survive. And the one that people often are pretty aware of, the first circle, is known as the threat system. Mm-hmm. So this is the aspect of our old brains, if you like, that really the motive there is threat protection and safety seeking, pretty much. So it does come along with emotions such as anxiety and anger or disgust, among other things as well. And actually, a lot of people have heard of the fight-flight response. Mm-hmm. So this is the threat system from a CFT point of view. The fight-flight response kind of fits in to the threat system. In fact, you can think of it as fight, flight, freeze, appease, or fight, flight, freeze, fawn is another way that people think about it. But basically, the threat system has these four different ways that we might try to deal with threat. We might try to fight it off. We might flee or run away. We might kind of freeze, on the spot. I have a a little kitten, and if I'm lying in bed and she's there and my toe just moves a little bit, boom, she pounces on. So I have to lie deadly still. Anyway, so that's a bit off track, but yes, that's the freeze response. And then the appease or fawn response. Actually, this is a very interesting one, because for humans, one of the biggest threats is social threats. The idea that we might be disapproved of or rejected or even cast out of the group. And of course, certainly for ancient humans, if we were cast out of the group, then, well, in some ways, then we were dead, basically, if we were out alone in the wilds and so on. So the appease strategy is often an attempt to kind of appease or seek approval, especially of those other humans that we might feel are of higher rank or further up the hierarchy or something like that. So that's the first circle. Or the group as a whole, exactly, right. Yes. Yeah,
and I just wanted to touch on that point quick, because I think it's really important that, we have these social defense mechanisms put in because as humans, we relied on each other to survive, right? There was no way around it. It's like there's this phenomenon of how non-social animals who only rely on themselves for survival, only about 1 to 2% of them make it to adulthood, right? And so, because they produce the scatter response. So when there's a threat, it's free for all, right? Yes. But then humans come in and they're like, no, we stick together. That's how we survive, because a group of humans can protect each other against an enormous variety of predators. But the cost of that is that if you don't fit into that group, or you get ostracized or kicked out, you're as good as dead. And so that appease response is a survival instinct, right? Which is weird to think about, but it absolutely is.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if we're sort of facing down a lion out in the wilds and, maybe there's half a dozen of us or something, we'll probably be able to shoo the lion away maybe or something like that. But if we're facing down a lion alone, then we're dead. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. And if we think about it today, a lot of us worry about what other people think of us, or are we being approved of, and we sort of do a lot of mind reading and other things like that. And it all sort of, comes back to this very core aspect of just those old brain aspects of ourselves, which really are all about trying to seek safety by staying safely in the group.
Yeah, seek safety and self-preservation, right? And
absolutely.
And that's, from a biological perspective, the most important thing, because it doesn't matter, and nothing else matters if you're going to die, right? So when that system takes over, it takes over, right?
Yes, that is actually a really great point about the threat system. It's a very immediate reactive system, and in fact, you and some of your listeners might be aware too that we often don't have to practice our threat system. That part of our response is actually already very, very reactive, very fine-tuned, and we might walk down the street and pass a bus stop, and there's a little collection of youths or something in the bus stop, and they start laughing, and suddenly it's what's wrong with me, sort of thing. That's the way that the threat system really responds very, very immediately.
Oh, absolutely, and it's an overwhelming sensation, right? A lot of the time.
Well, it feels like life or death. Yeah, that's so we sort of I should stop worrying about what people think, we'll say to ourselves. But actually, if we think about it from this evolutionary point of view, it's actually, it feels like it's a matter of life or death. That's where it really comes from. And so it makes sense that, it's valid, really, that actually we'll have these feelings, these thoughts, these physical sensations just kind of arise in us, as we're going about our day.
Yeah, 100%. And it's normal. I mean, it's not great, but, it's not our fault that this is how we're built.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. It's not our fault. That's what we're really wanting to do here, is to sort of de-blame or de-shame ourselves for kind of just how our brain works and how it's evolved to work. Our brain was designed for us in that way rather than designed by us. And so it's built in to the system. So we want to sort of de-shame ourselves around all of that and try to manage it, try to find ways that we can also, but that's the threat system. That's the first of the three circles. The second circle, or emotion regulation system, is known as the drive system. So, if the threat system had its way, I always say, it would keep us safe and warm in the cave. We'd be kind of hiding safely in the cave, but we couldn't stay in the cave. We had to go out and get stuff. We had to find, food and so on, but perhaps find a mate or maybe find other resources and tools and all the rest of it. So there's this second part, which also evolved and which also was a part of our survival and reproduction, and that's this drive system, this kind of wanting, pursuing, obtaining, achieving, and often emotions that come along with the drive system are more along the lines of perhaps excitement or pleasure or a sense of achievement or those kind of things. And so, even today, the drive system is really about kind of seeking some sort of success or that kind of thing. The tricky thing, of course, about the drive system, it comes along with trade-offs too, that idea of hedonic adaptation is an interesting little phrase. That idea that, we might be interested in getting a boat, perhaps, and then we do our research and we're sort of excited about it and we're thinking about the boat, and then one day we buy the boat and we are very happy and we're out on here it would be out on Moreton Bay and driving our little boat and all that sort of stuff, and then we go out again and it's still quite good, and then we go out again and it's good, and then eventually we want a bigger boat. That's the drive system, is this sort of we're sort of hedonic adaptation. We kind of want more and more. And if you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, that makes sense too. We couldn't go out, get a meal, and then rest on our laurels. We had to go out again the next day and the next day, and so it all makes sense. It's just these trade-offs that we're also grappling with. And so threat system and drive system can often be sources of suffering for us as well.
So, the hedonic adaptation is very interesting. It's, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's this, so we have to have a system that drives us towards achieving things and getting resources, right? But in the fact of having that system means that, that system's always going to be there. So even when you get things and you acquire things and you get resources and you achieve status or whatever it is that you're currently driven towards, it doesn't just switch off your drive system in virtue of having achieved it or gotten it, right? It just moves on to something else because the system is in place, right? In a similar way, the threat system, just because you survived the threat today, right? The lion didn't eat you, doesn't mean you're like, oh, cool, the threat system's done now, right? It's like, no, that system has to be there all the time because it evolved to protect us at all times, and the drive system evolved to drive us and motivate us at all times. And so that's why we fall into these traps of continuously wanting more and more. And so even if you get all the things that you think you want, or maybe you do want them, and you get all of them, that's great, and you'll feel satisfied and it will feel good. But then at some point, you adapt, and then you're like, oh, I want more stuff now, different stuff, bigger boat, more money or more cars, like whatever it is, because that drive system's still there.
And we wouldn't want to lose either of them, to be honest, either. Like threat and drive systems are still very useful today. If we're about to cross the road and a bus go onk sort of thing, we want to have that threat system to help us jump out of the way, I guess, and lots of examples where the threat system's still useful, and certainly the drive as well. But it's about,
was built on those two systems, arguably.
And the third one, which we'll come to in a moment.
Yeah.
But yes, exactly. It's much of our success as a species is thanks to some of these kind of old brain functions and the way they've worked. I mean, they're interesting though too, because the different systems will have interesting relationships with each other as well. So, for example, the primitive humans walking along the bush or something, the forest, and they hear a rustle in the bushes, and the first thing that kicks in is the threat system, which sort of wants you to flee. That could be something that'll eat me. And the next thing that'll kick in is the drive system. Ooh, that could be something I could eat. And so you sort of can sometimes be stuck between threat and drive, and it's sort of the classic example would be something like, perhaps you remember this yourself, is the sort of the university student who, kind of really wants to get, full marks in their exam, but is scared that they're going to fail. And so they have a really clean apartment because they do the vacuuming, and, they procrastinate or whatever. That's that kind of feeling stuck between threat and drive, and then perhaps this behavioural inhibition, this stuck point, and maybe we procrastinate or things like that. And there's various ways that threat and drive can relate to each other.
Yeah, and I think everyone would have an intuitive understanding of competing drives, at least, right? Where it is that sense of, I want more than one thing that contradict each other. So in your example, it's like, I want to run away from this thing that might eat me, but I also want to eat, and maybe I can eat this thing, right?
Yes.
And then, or as a university student, you get so stuck in the drive, and, then the threat system kicks in and goes, but like it's dangerous to do that, or like if you aim too high, you'll never achieve it, and all sorts of nonsense that goes on in the mind. And meanwhile, you're just looking for something to do to like make yourself feel better, and so you end up like cleaning because cleaning makes you feel good or something like that.
Yes, yeah. Or lots of things, lots of experiential avoidance, as they might say in ACT, might come into that sort of aspect of it. That we have a drink, or we sort of avoid going to university, or there might be other things we do to try to sort of relieve the tension there between threat and drive.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that there is that heavy tension, right? And it's very distressing when you're in that position, especially if they're very strong drives. I think if they're relatively small drives, it's easier to manage that tension because it's less tension, and the consequences of your decision are less significant. But when you have these what feel like massive decisions and massive drives, well, then the consequences are so much larger. They seem to be so much larger, and so the tension that builds up is therefore much greater, and so we're even more driven to relieve it, right? And if we don't know how to do it in healthy ways, we turn to unhealthy ways because we're just looking for something to relieve us in that moment because it's too uncomfortable and unpleasant to deal with, and just sit with it. And maybe we don't know that it will pass if we just let it be, right?
And in CFT, we think of those as motives. So the threat system has certain motives, namely motives around threat protection and seeking safety. And the drive system has certain motives, namely around obtaining and achieving and so on. And those are the competing motives that, that create that tension. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about this third system.
Well, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, the thing about humans is that our babies are born terribly, terribly vulnerable. They're sort of born premature, really, in some ways. We when we evolved to be standing upright and so on, that the pelvis changed shape, and the babies started to be born earlier and more vulnerable. When a baby's born, it sort of Well, it's probably not right to say that it's pathetic. That's a bit mean, but it's definitely
Useless.
yes, that's a bit mean as well. But anyway,
Yeah.
it's certainly it
Helpless.
can't do anything.
Helpless.
Helpless, lovely.
Helpless
That's
is
it.
the
That
word.
much
Yeah,
better.
yeah.
Much better. I mean, it even takes quite a lot of work to get them on the breast and to feed them. They certainly can't walk or talk for a couple of years. Often they don't leave home well into their 20s. So human babies
Yeah.
are terribly vulnerable. So we developed this third system, which is known as the soothing affiliative system. So this is all about really sort of closeness and connection, caring, motivation, looking after each other. It's a lot of so it's soothing affiliation. So it's sort of the affiliation piece is that piece around connection and closeness with others, and looking after each other. And so we often know intuitively. For example, if a little child is learning to ride a bike and the inevitable happens, they fall off their bike and they've scraped their knee and they're sort of upset about it. They're suffering a little bit by this fall. We often know intuitively. You go over to them. You perhaps pick them up and give them some soothing words. You might kind of validate what they've been through. Like, oh, that's a nasty one, and then you might kind of reassure them. You'll be okay, and then you might do something to help. You might get a Band-Aid or sort of something practical like that. And then you might encourage them, okay, back on the bike type thing. We sort of know intuitively as well. This is also built into our evolved brains, is this kind of ability or capacity to look after each other. And I mean, humans can be sort of cruel potentially as well, to each other maybe, and or to other humans or to other species. But actually, mostly we look after each other, which I think is why there's 8+ billion of us on the planet. We mostly look after each other and care for each other. And there's very interesting archaeological evidence of ancient human remains where certain disease processes in the bones there sort of would suggest that person would never have survived to the age they got to had they not had others looking after them, bringing them water or food or shelter. And so this has always been a part of kind of our species as well, this sort of looking after each other.
Yeah, like I remember reading about this phenomenon in, I believe it was archaeology, where someone was saying how they defined one of the markers of civilization was to see healed bones, right? Because in the wild, an animal that breaks its bones dies. But to see...
And is left behind, really.
Is left behind, most of the time. Or even if they aren't left behind, they're not going to survive very long because the predators are going to come en masse and just have their way, right? And anyway, so when humans were able to heal the broken bones of someone in their group, that was a mark of like significant social development, right? It was no longer leaving people behind where possible, which is what you were saying as well. It's like without the rest of the group, we wouldn't have made it as far as we did. And so this affiliative care, it's also, I think it's important to think about it as really hardwired into us, right? It's not like we're choosing this. We evolved this capacity to do so, and it's in everyone. And you can even look at the neuroscience of it too, right? Like affective neuroscience. And, like one of the things is like mirror neurons, right? The ability to feel what the other person is feeling simply by like interacting with them non-verbally, right? Now that's a capacity that we need to have empathy. And that's really important in order to bond socially and to support each other and to know what's happening. And that I don't know if this is true or not, but I would think that probably came before language evolved, because it's a pre-verbal way of communicating distress that you don't need language for, and then language evolved subsequently. Would you think do you think that makes sense to think about it that way?
Yeah, well, definitely. Humans evolved to have a kind of a social awareness, a sort of a knowing awareness, an intentionality about them, and things like empathy and so on absolutely kind of arises out of that. But so too does compassion, which I'm sure we'll sort of start to get to shortly. That it does. Compassion kind of, to a certain degree, arises out of the soothing system. It's certainly the caring motivation that's there in the soothing affiliative system kind of is a part of compassion. But interestingly enough, compassion really can draw on each of these emotion regulation systems. Sometimes to be compassionate, there might be threat system activation. We can be feeling anxious or even a kind of a righteous anger, so compassion can be textured with various emotions and so on. But no, I do think you're right. There's a kind of an element there of that sort of the neuroscience behind some of the connection and the social connection. Yeah. Sometimes where the threat system is known as fight flight, soothing affiliative system is sometimes known as rest and digest. That sort of notion that when the threats are gone and our tummies are full, then we can be in this soothing system, this sort of rest and digest, and sort of, I often think of the little lion cubs who are, they've had their food or whatever, and they're just rolling about with each other and relaxing and playing and so on. So that can often be part of the soothing affiliative system as well.
Yeah, I like the, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, rest, digest, tend, befriend. Right.
Good. Gotcha. There you go. Yeah.
That would be the comparative for. And what's
Absolutely
really fascinating about the soothing system is that it can override the threat system. And to think about that is you think about how, like some sort of mother bear or mother lion or something like that is willing to sacrifice herself or himself, it's the father figure, but whatever, the parental figure is willing to literally give up their lives for the sake of their young, right? Which means that they have to override their threat system with something in order to do that. So the threat system is extremely powerful, and yet the compassion soothing system is even more powerful sometimes, right? But
yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think of acts of great altruism where somebody sort of does something to sacrificing a part or the whole of themselves in order to sort of protect or save or reduce the suffering of another. In fact, compassion quite often involves the giving or maybe even the sacrificing of something, and we might sort of talk more about just certain qualities of compassion like wisdom and strength and courage, and kind of this caring motivation driving the whole thing, this desire to be helpful. And you're right, sometimes that can sort of override or certainly help to down-regulate threat.
Yeah.
In some ways, one of the nice ways to think about how we might operate these three circles when they're nicely in balance is we can think of, when the threat system is activated and there's anxiety or anger or something like that, the soothing affiliative system becomes kind of like the safe haven there. We move from threat to soothing. And that sort of helps to down-regulate threat, to help us to feel safe. And then from the soothing system, we might go out to the drive system. We can go out and explore the world and so on. From that soothing system now as a secure base. So the soothing affiliative is often kind of safe haven for threat and secure base for drive as well.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I think that's one of the fundamental lessons of CFT, right? Or the therapeutic interventions is learning to regulate that threat system. Because like if we look at people who have, let's say, chronic anxiety, for example, well,
yes,
what that presumably means is that their threat system is activated basically all the time. And
Yes.
all the time that they have anxiety. It's not really all the time, but like a lot of the time. And they don't know what to do with it because they don't know how to self-soothe or get soothed by other means. Right.
And actually, this is where I guess I mentioned threat, drive, and soothing as kind of old brain functions from an evolutionary point of view. But we also have what you might think of as kind of new brain functions, which are still ancient, but kind of evolutionarily speaking, perhaps these developed, slightly more recently. And this is kind of, this is really what you're talking about here too. If you think of the zebra out on the African plains or something like that, and just sort of standing around eating grass quite comfortably, but then the lion gets hungry and gets up and starts to chase the zebras, and the zebra's physiological state kind of goes way up, and now they're running and fleeing and jumping and trying to get away from the lion, and then eventually the lion catches one, I suppose. It's not a very happy ending for that particular zebra, but the lion catches one, and then the next thing you know, the lions are sort of chowing down on this particular zebra, and all the other zebras are now just standing around eating grass again. Their physiological state has now returned back to normal, so to speak.
Yeah.
What happens with humans is we'll have this old brain kind of physiological response, which is perhaps the threat system gets activated, and all of a sudden, our sort of the physical sensations, the thoughts and feelings are sort of going through the roof of anxiety, for example. But what happens then is our new brain kicks in, and we start to worry or have fearful imagining or start to ruminate or start to criticize ourselves. Self-criticism, for example, kicks in. And so all of a sudden the human's like, did you see that lion? Did you see how big its teeth were? What if it had caught me? What's it like to be eaten by a lion? You fool! You should have run faster, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So we have this ability, in a sense, to take the external threats and so on, and through these higher order brain functions, make that threat internal. And then that kind of state of anxiety then persists, and it happens a lot. I was driving home the other day, and I was going across a particular bridge here in Brisbane, and I sort of last minute I thought, I thought I was in the wrong lane, and so I made a fairly quick and I think overall safe lane change. But as I was changing lanes, the sort of the side rail kind of loomed large in a way, and it was sort of a little bit unsettling. And then kind of for the rest of the drive home, I was thinking about that a lot. And then I got home and I was sort of thinking, geez, that wasn't good. And sort of the memory of all of that, and we start to kind of ruminate over what happened, and then we sort of imagine, what could have happened, and so on. So there's lots of times where we get caught up in loops. Loops of the mind is what we think of them as in CFT, where something activates threat system, and then these higher order functions of the brain kind of take hold of that. And we get caught up in these sort of self-perpetuating loops, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that is one of those trade-offs, right? Like our higher order cognitive abilities enabled us to do remarkable things with symbolic thought. But the trade-off being that, we can also now imagine terrible things, right? So on the one hand, we can plan for the future, and we can learn from the past in very astounding ways. Right, that allowed us in part to evolve to where we are today as a civilization, but also the other side of it is like, we can also hyper fixate on things that we're afraid of, because we can imagine all the things that could possibly go wrong, and our brains aren't very good at telling the difference between quote unquote reality that's happening externally versus the images in our mind, right? It a lot of the time feels just as real. Maybe an order of magnitude less, but it's real enough that it activates our systems. And, like the way to think about that is like, the power of the mental image is like where you can think about something that made you really angry, right? A past incident. And if you think about it hard enough and you really put yourself back in that position, like you're going to start to feel the anger inside of you, whatever that feels like for you. And the same thing for fear and shame and any emotional experience, really.
Yes.
And then we get stuck on loops trying to solve this problem as if it were a problem, because that's what your brain's trying to do. But it's just not very helpful, and all of a sudden you're just emotionally out of whack, and you're suffering needlessly at your own, mind, and it happens to all of us, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, you might think of a delicious meal, and that's enough to trigger certain aspects of physiological responses. In fact, it probably, if I think about it, triggers drive system, in a way. And now we're kind of salivating at the mouth, thinking about this delicious meal. But unfortunately, it happens for people too, with much more difficult sorts of phenomena. And unfortunately, things like trauma or shame experiences or, other things like that can absolutely, when remembered, can get us caught up in those same loops. I was speaking with someone just yesterday about, she had a very difficult upbringing, and her father was a very difficult person, and she has enormous anger he's actually passed now, but still has this anger directed towards him for what he did. And so she gets a bit caught in loops there. But then the next thing that happens is she gets angry at herself because she thinks, why am I still thinking about him? I shouldn't be thinking about him. I should move on with my life and let all that go. And so then she's starting to feel angry towards and critical, really, towards herself. And then from there, she starts to think, this will never end. I'll never get over this. And that leads to feelings of sadness, or even she can really get down or depressed sometimes. So there's not only that initial loop in and around the experience itself, but then there's this kind of aspect which is how we relate to ourselves as we have these experiences as well.
Such tricky brains.
Tricky brains.
They're
exactly.
A goddamn nightmare to deal with sometimes.
Well, there's these trade-offs. I mean, because you're right. Like, to be able to imagine, to be able to remember, to be able to monitor ourselves in the context of our social world and so on. I mean, those are very massive strengths for us. Exquisitely designed to help us to not only survive and so on, but really to flourish as a species. But imagining becomes fearful imagining, and remembering becomes ruminating, and self-monitoring becomes self-criticism. And then we're caught up in these much more difficult loops, and we sort of suffer, really, as a result of all of that, with anxiety and depression, as you say.
Yeah, and suffer greatly. Like, I think to varying degrees for each person, but, it kills people. Like, there's no way around that, right? Like, you can think yourself to death in a very real sense. Not actively, but it happens to lots of people, right? I mean, suicide is an epidemic at the moment. Maybe it's always been, but we certainly know a lot about it now. And fundamentally, what so much of that is our mind's commentary and imaging and imagining various aspects of our lives that we've lived or that we have yet to live and that we think that we'll never get, and all of the shame and the self-blame and the self-criticism and the self-judgment, and all externally projected. So it's blaming the world and blaming life and God and the universe, and that fuel of anger and just giant mess of emotions that eventually, in some people, becomes a pain that seems too unbearable to continue, right? So that's like a serious trade-off for some people.
Yeah, and you know what? It's not our fault.
No.
That's the key piece there. Is all of that stuff you've described, and in various ways we go through that, and actually none of it's our fault. You know, we were born with these tricky brains that were designed for us, you know, and not biased. We were born with various genetic strengths and weaknesses that we also didn't get to choose. And then we were born into a family or a caregiving arrangement or a culture or a country or nation or whatever it might be that we also didn't get to choose, you know, and yet all of that kind of shapes us and shapes us in terms of gradually who we become. And so this is sort of the thing, isn't it? You know, like it's not our fault. Even when we're feeling terrible anxiety or we're feeling terribly down or depressed, it is our tricky brain and it's our own personal experiences. And so, you know, but how to manage that? That's the interesting thing too. You know, like our brains also are able to sort of learn and change and grow. And there's kind of optimism there as well. Maybe there are certain things that we can discover that can help us to manage our tricky brains.
100%. Let's talk about some of those things, because I think that's super important, right? In terms of, I think we'll keep it general, obviously, because it's a general conversation. But so, you know, starting off with this idea of self-compassion, maybe, right? Now, would you say that that's a good first step for people, is to start cultivating a compassionate inner self?
Yes, excellent. I mean, this is where compassion focused therapy will, you know, definitely go next. Is to start to think about, you know, perhaps what is compassion and self-compassion really, and how can we start to cultivate that part of ourselves, that you know might be compassionate towards others or might be compassionate towards ourselves, but you know we think of this as the compassionate self, you know, that the sort of the part of ourselves that's compassionate. In CFT we really think of compassion as a sensitivity to suffering in ourselves and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent that suffering. So that's kind of it. You know, it's sort of it's a sensitivity to suffering, but it's right in the definition. You know, it's about being able to be compassionate towards ourselves as well as others, and it really is a motivation or a commitment to try to take action to help to alleviate some of that suffering and perhaps prevent future suffering as well. So we really think of compassion across three flows, that we might be compassionate towards others, we might try to open ourselves up to receiving compassion from others, and we might try to develop that ability to relate to ourselves compassionately or develop that idea of self-compassion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that it seems to me that most people are probably fairly good at being compassionate towards other people, right? That's a pretty, as we had discussed earlier, it's a pretty hardwired function of being a human. Now, some people might not have that experience, and due to the environment they were raised and things like that, where compassion was seen as a weakness or something along those lines, they have suppressed and turned off that ability in themselves, and some may be pathologically incapable, and okay, fair enough. But by and large, people can be compassionate towards other people. Then the next one I would say in line is like receiving compassion for others. I would say probably you get a mixed bunch of some people who can receive compassion well, and other people who can't. And then self-compassion, I would say, is the least well-developed, you know, flow of compassion from a general perspective in terms of like most people, especially because our culture doesn't value self-compassion, although it should. It primarily values achievement and growth and, discipline and things like that, all of which are very important. So it's not that we should get rid of them, but we also need to incorporate this element of, well, actually, to really be the best version of yourself, you need to treat yourself with compassion, right? And you need to relate to yourself compassionately for yourself and for other people, because the best version of you isn't going to be torturing yourself, right? It's going to be doing the right thing for yourself. And that, as you said earlier, that takes wisdom and courage, right? It's not like it's just being kind and soft and gentle. It's like sometimes being compassionate is doing what you really don't want to do because you need to do it because it's good for you, right?
You said a lot of great stuff there, and in terms of compassion for others, I mean, this is the one that people are often most familiar with, and when we think of compassion, we often think of compassion for others. It often, compassion for others isn't boundless, though. Like a lot of people will have certain things that perhaps get in the way even of compassion for others, especially if certain appraisals, like if the other person who is suffering is very different to us, or, perhaps we feel like they're to blame for their own suffering, or maybe we're not really sure how to help or whether we can cope with what, with dealing with that or with what they're going through. So there can sometimes be little barriers there as well. But most people, as you say, have a sense when it comes to family and friends and their community and so on. Yeah, they absolutely can connect with that idea of compassion for others, which is great, really, because that's often a nice way in. So for someone who doesn't feel as comfortable or as able to be compassionate towards themselves, often what we'll do is we'll have a think. What's it like when you're compassionate to others? What's a memory of a time when you were compassionate towards someone else? What did that feel like in the body? What was the physiology of that, or your body posture, or your facial expression or voice tones? Can we have a sense of what it's like for you when you're in that compassionate motivation? And then is there a way that we can gradually start to practice that and direct that also towards ourselves in a way? I remember being at a mindful self-compassion retreat many years ago, and Chris Germer, who was one of the developers of MSC, Mindful Self-Compassion, he sort of said that in many ways, we're compassionate to human beings and to other living creatures, and maybe even to the world, but we're compassionate to other human beings, and we're a human being too. So in some ways, all self-compassion is just slightly widening our circle of compassion to also include ourselves. And so that can be a really nice way in, is just to think, what am I like? What do I do? What does it feel like? How do I think when I'm being compassionate towards someone else? And can I start to offer that same kind of compassion to myself when I'm also suffering or struggling or facing life difficulties and so on?
Yeah, because it's the same physiological system that gets activated, right? Yeah, of that compassion. So it makes sense that you can start off with, well, what's it like to be compassionate to other people? What's it like to receive compassion from other people? And then change the direction of the intention, let's say, to include ourselves in that circle, right? Which I think is often very difficult for people to do.
Yes.
It is, especially people who are high in self-criticism and self-judgment and self-shame, right? The compassion element is, which is why CFT exists, evidently, because of, people who are like that. And again, it's not their fault that they're like that, and there's ways that we can learn to work through that. But fundamentally, it's like there's a big blockage against being compassionate towards yourself. Right.
And this was... Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
This was one of Professor Paul Gilbert's kind of real discoveries, I guess you could say, or something that is very important in amongst all of this. And that is that we do experience fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion and self-compassion. There can be certain fears. In other words, we might feel fearful that actually if we're compassionate towards ourselves, then we'll just be seen as weak, or somehow we'll be kind of judged negatively for that. Or there might be blocks where the person thinks, I'd kind of like to be self-compassionate, but I don't even really know how to do it. Like, what does that even mean to be self-compassionate? And then there can be resistances, self-compassion, like it's dog eat dog out there. You got to be tough, or something like that. So we have these fears, blocks, and resistances. And probably a really important one is just as you said, and that is our tendency towards self-criticism. We're often more likely to, it's so interesting. We treat ourselves, differently to how we would treat a friend. Like if we had a friend and we were trying to motivate them or whatever, we probably wouldn't say to them the kinds of critical, harsh, sort of sometimes self-attacking, self-condemning things that we might say to ourselves in the form of that self-criticism. And so, but, like oddly enough, we do that thinking it's going to motivate us only to really feel kind of less motivated and feel small and no good. And some of that really shame-based self-criticism just leads to feelings of shame. Yeah. And so, but we worry, if I'm not self-critical, what if I get lax and lazy? Or what if I make mistakes? Or, I need to be self-critical because if I can be critical towards myself first, then nothing anyone else will say will ever hurt me. Or, there'll be these things that people attach to self-criticism that makes them, or really blocks them from this idea of self-compassion. And so often with CFT, that really, in some ways, that is the work, is to identify what might be some of the things, the barriers, the blocks, the reservations around self-compassion, and how can we start to work through some of those so that some of that that self-compassion that is in there can actually start to arise in the person.
So, perhaps like something that one can do is to just think about, what function do I believe my self-criticism plays in my life, right? Because it's questionable whether it does serve that function or not. And if I'm not mistaken, the research suggests that criticism is not a very good motivator. You can see this in any parenting literature, right? That's not the best way to parent children, is by, through like harsh criticism and judgment and blame. Like, it just doesn't work so well. Like, it might work a little bit, but you're also, doing a little bit of damage. Whereas, compassionate encouragement, while also being firm and tough and, structured and things like that, like, it's not just a free-for-all, but that's where the real empowerment comes from. And so if you look in oneself at, like, well, what function does my self-criticism seem to serve? Like, what is it telling me it's doing for me? That's a good place to start to see, okay, well, is this really true or not, right? And maybe experiment with something else. Maybe say, okay, well, instead of, I know, my brain's going to tell me all these things because I messed this up or I'm worried about this or that, but like, maybe I'm going to try something else, right? Maybe this hasn't been working so well, and that's why I can't get rid of this, like, perpetual suffering that I'm inflicting on myself. So maybe try something else. Try be compassionate towards yourself and see what happens, right? What's the worst that can happen? Doesn't work.
Yes, it's exactly. And you sort of alluded to the idea too that there is such a thing as self-improving self-criticism, like that we can actually sort of do something and then just critique how we went and notice the bits that didn't go so well and kind of practice that maybe. The professional golfer who after a the game sort of works out, I didn't do so well with my short game, so I'll just go to the practice sand trap or something and hit 1,000 balls. That's good, actually. That's helpful, that sort of self-improving self-criticism. But yes, it's the self-hating, self-attacking, self-condemning, shame-based self-criticism that can actually be very problematic when it comes to, motivation, but also just sort of psychological distress and so on. There's a really
I'll just tell you a quick story. So when I first started doing podcasting, right, I had a really hard time listening and watching myself because all that would come up is just huge self-criticism and judgment, and it was just painful to watch, right? Because all I could see were problems, and why didn't I do it differently, or this is bad, or that's bad, or you should have known better, you should have done better, you should have said better, right? All of these things that would start, and then eventually I was just like, I can't do it. It's too stressful, too painful, and then eventually, and it's worse if you're watching. It's a matter of interest than just listening, because then you get the visual element too, and it's like, why am I sitting like that? Why does my head look like that? It's just like all sorts of nonsense. But eventually I reached the point where, because I forced myself to keep doing it for lots of different reasons, partly because I have to, but also because I was like, that's how I'm going to get better. And I reached this point where I was like, well, what if I approach it like I'm watching a podcast that's not with me in it, right? So I'm trying to take this objective approach of saying, what if I viewed this like I was a fan of the show instead of it being me in the seat, right? And say, okay, so yes, I can identify areas that I think could be better, right? I can use less filler words. I can look at the camera more. I can have better questions to ask. So yes, there's very important areas for improvement, and I'm still improving, hopefully every time. But I don't view myself in the same light of saying all of these harsh self-judgments. It's more just like practical steps that I can take to improve, and that really made a big difference. That sort of cognitive shift from viewing it as me and feeling like I was there, to being like, no, I'm just going to watch this as if I were editing or watching another podcast, and it just happens to be me in there. And that just made a huge difference, right? Now, I know it's not exactly self-compassion, but it's interesting to know that, you can change your way you look at things and yourself, right? Because now I no longer have these harsh self-criticisms, and I'm happy to watch videos of me. It doesn't even bother me in the slightest. Even when I mess up or say something silly or say something I shouldn't have or whatever it is, I'm like, yeah, it happens, I didn't plan on it. A lot of this stuff is just what happens in the moment, and so that just is what it is, and I accept it and just move forwards and say, what would I say to someone if it weren't me, right? Would I say, oh, you're so stupid, why did you say that? That was so dumb, you should have thought better. No, I wouldn't say that to someone at all, right? I would say, no, it's okay, maybe there's some consequences to this, or here's how we can do better next time. And you just build up. And so that was a really interesting lesson that I learned doing, podcast editing over the years.
Beautiful example. And what you managed to do there was just have sort of mind awareness. I mean, you brought awareness to your mind and your tricky brain and what it was doing, and the way that the self-criticism was sneaking in, and that it was kind of, it nearly derailed the whole thing in a way, but whereas what you managed to do was make a shift from that more painful shame-based self-criticism to what you called before, which is that compassionate self-correction and compassionate encouragement. Coming from a compassionate motivation, still wanting to do well, still wanting to improve and kind of flourish with the stuff you're doing. But coming from that much more compassionate motivation. And if you think about sort of for many of us, the kind of almost daily analogous kind of experience is just when we're looking in the mirror in the morning. A lot of us look in the mirror, but sort of don't look in the mirror. We're sort of brushing our teeth or combing our hair. I don't comb my hair much, and so
Neither do
don't know
I.
about that. But neither do you. Okay, sorry. Yeah, but you know, we're there. We are in the mirror, but we're kind of averting our gaze, because when we look at ourselves, up comes the self-criticism. You know, we worry about something about how we look, or what we, you know, whatever it might be. And the interesting thing, and I'll just plant this seed actually for perhaps some of your listeners, but you know, to see if you can practice self-compassion in the mirror. You know, in the morning, you're there in the bathroom, you're doing your thing, and then you just pause and you just look into your own eyes, and you see the humanity there, and the way that we have, you know, sort of these lives that we're leading, and we're sort of, there's good bits and not so good bits, and we sort of struggle with certain things, and we have these tricky brains, and then just a little expression of self-compassion. You know, may you be well, may you be peaceful, may you cope with the things that might face you today as you go about your day. So there's sort of, I think even that's a nice little kind of moment to sort of practice the self-compassion.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect moment to practice it, because that's arguably when people are most critical of themselves, right? To do with our appearance, and one of the least controllable things in our lives most of the time. By and large, I mean, you can do some stuff, but like you pretty much are who you are, right? And so to really take that approach and look at yourself and say, you know, I'm just a human, and I have struggles in life, and it's okay, and you know, my struggles are important to me, and it doesn't matter what other people's struggles are at this moment. Like, it's just about thinking about me and all the good things and all the bad things, and, you know, what would it be like to be compassionate to include myself in that circle, right? As another human.
Yeah.
Really
as you said earlier, it is tricky to do, and it takes practice and so on. I mean, in CFT, there might be a little sequence that we would work through to kind of get to that point, you know, and so it really begins with bringing it back to the body and trying to kind of, I mean, threat system and drive system, I guess, is all very much sympathetic nervous system activation. It's all about the body upregulating itself, and versus, you know, kind of the parasympathetic nervous system, where it might be more about down-regulating and creating a sense of calmness and safeness. And so we really try to practice, you know, parasympathetic nervous system activation, is slowing down the body, slowing down the mind, using things like body posture, facial expression, inner voice tone, soothing rhythm breathing, going really back to all of these kind of fundamentals in a way to mainly help to create a sense of safeness and calmness, but also a sense of strength and groundedness in the body. And then the next step might be, especially using imagery type practices and so on, is to, again, kind of cultivate a sense of safeness and calmness. A good colleague of ours, Dr. Deborah Lee, has a little saying that is, a calm mind thinks differently. And so if we can use the body and use the imagery to create a sense of safeness and calmness, then we can start thinking differently and approaching differently, perhaps the various aspects of our lives and what we might be facing. And then from there, then we start to tap into cultivating the compassion itself. And you mentioned them again, but yes, the key qualities really there that we start to kind of play with and learn about and practice, and using imagery, using embodiment practices and so on, is really to cultivate that wisdom. You know, that we all just find ourselves here, that we have these tricky brains, that there's these trade-offs. You know, in some ways they're really powerful brains that are really helpful. In other ways, our brains do cause us a lot of suffering. And so that sort of the wisdom of, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. You know, that's the wisdom piece of compassion. And then we move to strength and courage, having that sense of strength, stability, determination, emotional courage, confidence, that, I feel kind of steady and ready for, what may arise. And I know I can work towards coping with that too. And then the third key quality is a caring commitment. So this sort of commitment to being caring, but sort of supportive, encouraging, helpful. In fact, that's a nice little phrase as well. Compassion is, may I be helpful to myself and others. May I be helpful rather than harmful to myself and others. And so we really start to practice all of those qualities, really start to develop and gradually embody this compassionate self.
Yeah.
What it's like to really embody that part of me that is compassionate. And then we can take that part of ourselves to things like our anxiety or anger or sadness, to our self-criticism or our shame, to those moments where we're feeling dark and depressed even. We start to bring our compassionate self to those other aspects of ourselves and gradually start to soften some of those aspects of suffering that we might be experiencing.
Yeah, and it's a process, right? Like
it's a process.
You can't just switch it. And it takes a long time. I mean, you have to think about how long it took you to get to where you are right now, and how many iterations of the self-criticism you've run through in your head. And so you're starting up a whole competing motivation that, I mean, it has some foundation to it, and, fair enough, and you can build it up quicker than you don't need the same amount of time as the rest of your life, but it's something that takes time and that's worth working towards, right? And it's probably a relatively exponential growth. Like, it probably starts off like real slow, and really difficult to do. But as you keep going and keep going, things pick up, and it gains more traction and more strength. And you build your internal resources, and you learn to ground yourself in your body better, and you learn to notice what's happening in your mind and in your body a lot quicker and a lot sooner, and with less judgment and less shame. And then you can start to make choices about how you want to approach yourself and others, and actually act on the commitment of, may I be helpful to myself, right? Or may I be helpful to myself and others. And I think that it's a really powerful tool and a powerful strategy.
Yeah. And just as a matter of interest, we've carried out various preliminary studies and some randomized controlled trials with CFT in groups. We've published a little while ago a program with female survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and used compassion-focused therapy there, and have found, really strikingly, we found both reductions in shame, but also in some of those post-traumatic stress-related symptoms. So CFT kind of seems to help there. We've also done some work with combat veterans and their partners, running a sort of a CFT group, and that's just been published quite recently, and again found some real improvements, not only for the veterans themselves, but also for their spouses. Changes in self-criticism over I think that was about a 6-week intervention. And then thirdly, another RCT that's coming out very soon is with people who were experiencing body weight shame. So shame specifically about their sort of appearance and bodies. And again, that was a 12-week intervention, I think, where it really showed improvements in self-criticism and shame. So you're right, it does take practice, and there's a kind of sometimes it sort of starts slower, if you like, and whatever, but actually over a sort of a relatively 6 to 12 weeks, say, or whatever, it really, people can make changes and can start to soften some of that self-criticism and shame, and just cultivate that more compassionate self-to-self relating.
Yeah. No, and that's a fantastic timeline, relatively speaking, right? I mean, if you could change the way you relate to yourself in 12 weeks, like, man, you got your whole life ahead of you,
Yeah. Well, exactly. It's two steps forward, one step back. But I think, there's definitely some real utility in cultivating this compassionate part of ourselves.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, listen, Stan, thanks so much for coming back on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I will link all of your stuff in the description. Is there anything you would like to promote of yourself? Where can people find you? Please.
Well, yes, I would. Well, firstly, thank you, Shane, for having me on your wonderful podcast. I'm so glad you persisted with it.
Yeah.
I'm a regular listener as well, and so it's great stuff. I'm more than happy for people to email me. I'm Stan at psychologyconsultants.com.au. I do have a website, stansteindl.com, and also on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it. There's a few things happening. Probably one thing is I run a fairly regular compassionate mind training course. So if anybody is interested in doing some work in this area, by all means email me and I can send you some information. And so yeah, thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, and look forward to having you on again soon.
Okay, thanks, Shane.